and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hi there, very good afternoon to you. Welcome to Brazier, some fast-paced news from 4 until 6. In the next hour or so, full coverage of Britain's new refugee policy. A former Australian foreign minister tells me why the only thing that acts as a deterrent against economic migrants is the prospect of being sent somewhere they don't want to go. We debate whether the courts will put a stop to Priti Patel's long-awaited plan to stop boats crossing the English Channel. Boats bearing would-be migrants, that is. And we'll ask a former Royal Navy Admiral how the Ministry of Defence will get involved in its deployment against illegal migration. Also on the show, as the SNP finally rolls back the legal requirement for face masks in Scotland, we'll ask a doctor why some Scottish GPs want to put an end to the serving of meat in some hospitals. Alongside me throughout today's show, the former Labour Party advisor Scarlett Maguire, who's got some things to get off her chest today, will explain. But first, the headlines with Polly.
Colin, thank you. Just after 4 o'clock, the latest headlines from GB News. As you've been hearing, the Royal Navy is taking over command from Border Force in the English Channel under new government plans to tackle illegal migration. The Prime Minister has also confirmed asylum seekers will be flown to Rwanda for processing as part of a £120 million deal. Boris Johnson says they'll have the capacity to resettle tens of thousands of people over the coming years, and the scheme will serve as a considerable deterrent as well. He told a news conference the partnership complies with international obligations, but he's still expecting a legal challenge.
Safe and legal routes for asylum, while disrupting the business model of the gangs. Because it means that economic migrants taking advantage of the asylum system will not get to stay in the UK. We're confident that our new migration partnership is fully compliant with our international legal obligations. But nevertheless, we expect this will be challenged in the courts.
Boris Johnson. Well, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, in reaction described the plan as a desperate effort to distract from the Prime Minister's Partygate fine.
They're unworkable, they're extortionate, they're going to cost taxpayers billions of pounds, and they just reflect a Prime Minister who's got no grit, no answers to the questions that need answering, and no shame. And I just think Britain deserves better than this.
Sir Keir Starmer. Ambulance response times and A&E performance in England have dropped to their lowest levels on record. That's as the latest figures show 6.2 million patients are currently on the NHS waiting list, with 23,000 waiting more than 2 years to start routine treatment. Top surgeons are describing the data as shocking. Joe Golding is a patient with rheumatoid arthritis and has been waiting for various surgeries since the summer of 2018.
This delay will have a long-lasting impact on me for the rest of my life because of the way that the joints now have deteriorated. it isn't just a case of a straightforward operation now, then there needs to be repairs. I don't expect special treatment. I don't want special treatment. I would just like to have fair access.
Jo Goulding. Well, the UK's medicines regulator has approved the use of the COVID Moderna vaccine in children aged between 6 and 11 years old. Earlier on today, a sixth coronavirus vaccine produced by the French firm Valneva was also given the green light. The UK is the first country in the world to approve the jab. International news, and Russia is warning it'll deploy nuclear weapons and hypersonic missiles in the Baltic Sea if Sweden and Finland join NATO. The two countries are on the verge of applying for membership. The deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, says if they do, the balance needs to be restored and there'll be no more talk of a nuclear-free region. Meanwhile, Ukraine says a new prisoner swap has been agreed with Russia. 30 Ukrainians are due to return home today. Earlier, the country's military said it hit Russian warship Moskva with a missile, causing serious damage. It reportedly started to sink after ammunition on board the vessel began to explode. Moscow claims it's still afloat and being towed to port. It says crew members were evacuated safely from the ship. Latest figures show almost 6,500 Ukrainian refugees have now arrived in the UK. 13,000 entered under the Ukraine Family Scheme and over 3,000 through Homes for Ukraine sponsorship. The Home Office says it's received just shy of 95,000 applications so far. 25,000 visas have been granted. More than 300 people have been killed in floods on South Africa's eastern coastline. Heavy rains have blocked roads and disrupted shipping in Durban. Hundreds of people have been displaced in what's being described as one of the worst flooding events in South Africa's history. The country's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, pledged to help after visiting families whose homes had been destroyed. Her Majesty the Queen is expected to miss the traditional Easter Sunday service at Windsor Castle this weekend because of mobility issues. That's come after she missed today's Royal Maundy service for the first time. The Prince of Wales and Duchess of Cornwall represented the monarch today, distributing money as part of an ancient tradition to community members from across the country. You're with GB News. We'll have more news as it happens. Now back to Brazier.
Here's our top story. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has unveiled his new plan for tackling illegal immigration. Male migrants that reach the UK on small boats across the Channel will be flown to Rwanda while their asylum claims are processed. Our Home and Security editor, Mark White, has been to Kent with the Prime Minister to look at the proposals.
Entering Dover Harbour, the all-too-familiar sight of yet another Border Force vessel arriving here packed with would-be asylum seekers. Hundreds of people pulled from small boats in the middle of the English Channel. 28,500 last year alone, and already this year it's clear that record is set to be smashed. The Prime Minister, deeply frustrated by his government's inability to stem the flow of small boats, is now putting himself front and centre of those efforts, travelling to Kent to meet the teams at the sharp end as the Royal Navy takes over command and control of Channel operations. And in a major shift of policy, the announcement that most of those who arrive here illegally will be sent on a one-way journey to Rwanda after that African nation agreed a multi-million-pound deal with the UK.
So from today, our new migration and economic development partnership will mean that anyone entering the UK illegally, as well as those who have arrived illegally since January the 1st, may now be relocated to Rwanda. This innovative approach, driven by our shared humanitarian impulse and made possible by Brexit freedoms, will provide safe and legal routes for asylum,
4,000 miles from the UK, the Home Secretary was in the Rwandan capital to see the first in a series of new accommodation blocks being prepared to house the asylum seekers. Those sent here will be processed, and if they're granted asylum, their new life will be in this country. They won't be allowed to settle in the UK. The government is not planning to send women, children or indeed married men to Rwanda, only single males. But that's still the vast majority of those arriving by small boats. Last year, 70% of small boat arrivals were single men. UK authorities are now operating a fleet of these drones over the channel, and from today the Royal Navy takes over command of channel operations. In the weeks ahead, these drones will be joined by Navy Wildcat helicopters and a fleet of new patrol boats. Human rights groups have already condemned the plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda as cruel and inhumane. But one Border Force former senior manager believes it's the right thing to do.
Now they won't want to get into the hands of UK authorities because they won't want to go offshore to Rwanda. So the Navy will be able to intercept those people that don't want to be intercepted.
Any move to send asylum seekers to Rwanda could still be some way off, as it's inevitable human rights groups will seek to challenge it in the courts. In the meantime, as hundreds continue to arrive by small boat daily, the government says it's also planning to house asylum seekers in purpose-built accommodation centres, rather than spending the estimated £5 million a day to put them up in hotels across the country. Mark White, GB News, Kent.
We start with my take today on the Rwanda announcement and a question. Did you hear it all over London today? The stamping of little feet, the Twitter tantrums of people who think they really run this country. Not the ones you elected, but the campaigners and lobbyists and commentators. They had two reasons to be cross. First, they hate the idea that the public might actually want to control who comes into the country, even if that means putting migrants on a plane to Rwanda. Second, they were driven to distraction by the idea that Boris might be wriggling off the Partygate hook. Exhibit A, Michal Hussein, this morning on the BBC radio programme she co-hosts. She said, "Why should people stick to legal migration routes when the Prime Minister has acted outside the law?" Think about that question from our licence fee-funded state broadcaster. Was Hussein really asking if a migrant pondering whether to pay an illegal people smuggler might now feel emboldened to do so because laws were broken when parties were held during lockdown at Downing Street? Wow. The BBC's obsession with that story was obvious when the PM announced his new Rwanda policy. The corporation got to ask the first questions after his speech, and sure enough, the BBC didn't want to get into the detail of this massive departure for British immigration policy. No? What did they want to talk about?
What would you say to the people watching at home who think that you have been guilty of hypocrisy for not following the rules you told them they must follow? And what would you say to the MPs who think you lied to them?
Well, there are questions that the BBC isn't asking about Boris's bold migrant processing experiment, and here are 5 of them. Question 1. How many will come if nothing is done? The number crossing by boat is roughly tripling every year. We're now into the tens of thousands, using a method once thought totally impractical. So I repeat, how many will come if nothing is done? A year ago, the former British Foreign Secretary, William Hague, wrote in The Times that Britain was in total denial about the scale of the migration wave about to hit its shores. Much of it will be driven by sub-Saharan fertility, where birth rates defy the usual laws of demographic gravity. So how many will come if nothing is done? In time, who knows? Millions, maybe, who knows? Question 2. How many migrant lives will be saved? Dozens have perished in the Channel in small boats, 27 in one incident last year alone. When the Australians introduced a plan similar to the one announced today, it involved sending migrants to be processed in the Pacific. 3,000 miles away, the numbers fell dramatically. In 2013, 20,000 migrants arrived by boat in Oz. 2 years later, none did. If nobody's travelling, the logic runs, nobody's drowning. Question 3. Why does this policy have to be quite so dramatic? Why can't we just figure things out with the French? Well, as a younger journalist, I sat in a press conference watching the then French Interior Minister, one Nicolas Sarkozy, sitting alongside our then Home Secretary, David Blunkett. They'd found a solution to the migrant crisis, except that they hadn't. And the truth is, if the French are not willing to cooperate, and they're often not, it's down to us, the UK alone, to take control and fix things. Question 4. How will people smugglers try and evade our new tactic? Well, they can no longer expect British ships to act effectively as a taxi service. If a migrant now knows that if they're taken under the arm of the British state, they may end up in Rwanda, then they will resort to more clandestine methods. The days of migrants relaxed and smiling and giving Viva Victory signs on British beaches may be over. Now the game will be to enter Britain without detection. The fact that the military is being drafted in may reflect the fact that some young men will need to be restrained. And by the way, 70% of them are single men under the age of 35. And finally, question 5, will this policy be thwarted? Mr. Johnson was elected on a manifesto that made clear a desire to control illegal migration. We're not alone. The centre-left government of Denmark is also looking at processing asylum applications in Central Africa, and the opinion polls show strong support for tough measures here. But as the PM said in his speech, he was braced for legal challenges. Many of those who condemned him today will never have to live in neighbourhoods where the often messy business of multinational assimilation takes place. The lawyers and NGOs and commentators will see this as a moral question. For them, Boris is more than just mistaken about this. In their eyes, being nasty to the huddled masses makes him not just wrong, but bad. And you and me too, if we have the temerity to agree with him. So 5 key questions which the BBC, in common with others, don't want you to think about today. They'd rather keep banging on about Partygate so they can claim a scalp they believe their journalistic acumen deserves. But make no mistake, today saw the inauguration of a new phase in Britain's culture wars. Priti Patel, in particular, has pulled off the seemingly impossible task of finding what looks like a workable solution to a seemingly insoluble problem. After 2 years of COVID paralysis, this government has taken a major step towards delivering on the promise of Brexit. That's the break. What you couldn't see is what I could see through my peripheral vision, which was my presenter's friend today, Scarlett Maguire, who's not about to be especially friendly. Scarlett.
Well, I mean, I don't know where to be. The first thing to say is, how do you legally claim asylum in this country?
We talked about this earlier.
Yes, but we talked about it off air. This is really important. There is no legal means of claiming asylum.
Is that not to endorse an illegal means?
What I'm saying is that actually it would be a sensible thing if we worked out a way to claim asylum legally, right, in Africa or France or wherever, instead of saying, no, nobody's allowed here, so the only way you can get here is illegally. There is no question about that. And then the people who come over, who you like to call migrants, actually 98% of them do claim asylum. 2/3 of them are accepted by the Home Office as genuine refugees.
We know, don't we? We know from people who understand this area that there's a lot of coaching going on. People game the system. They claim protection. It's human nature. I'd do it. You do it. You game the system. You say things that you know are likely to guarantee you the extension of your stay here. It's notoriously difficult to deport people, even when you've proven that they are not legitimate asylum seekers. I'm not sure about the 98% figure. I do think you raise a legitimate question about how people do claim asylum.
But I think it's really important. How can we say that we're going to deport all illegal asylum seekers when there is no route to come here legally? Right. I mean, that is just impossible. And it's one of the reasons I don't think this is ever going to work. I think this is another one of Boris Johnson's shiny things.
You've just put a question to me, Scarlett. Let me put a question to you. I made the point, one of my 5 in my monologue there, about the fact that we have no idea where the upper limit of those wanting to come to the UK is. I mean, it could be millions. Look at the projections for sub-Saharan Africa. If I was living in a country and I wanted to improve the circumstances of me and my family, I would want to come to the UK too. And I wouldn't really care if it looked reasonably safe across the Channel. I'd take that option. We're talking potentially about millions.
Okay, so what do we do? So
we don't let everybody in.
That's not what I said. What I said is there should be legal routes, right? So actually it should be possible to be an asylum seeker in an African country, to go to a British embassy and to get a visa. But the other thing is, what's this government done? It's cut international aid. I mean, actually, you talk about sub-Saharan Africa.
We're going to come back to that. We'll get you back on that, I promise. We've got another guest to fit in. Amongst those who've been campaigning for new curbs on illegal migration to Britain, the Rwanda plan has been broadly welcomed, but some think it may not work or won't go far enough. The former MEP and director of the Centre for Migration, Stephen Wolfe, likened the plan to putting a sticking plaster over a major wound. Stephen Wolfe joins me now. Stephen Wolfe, welcome to you. Do you know the answer to Scarlett Maguire's question, whether there are legal means by which somebody can apply for asylum in the UK from a foreign country? Is the only option they've got is to pay a people smuggler to get them in on a boat?
Well, Charlotte is wrong in that, because first of all, there are legal routes into the UK. David Cameron established legal routes with the United Nations when we allowed in 25,000 Syrians. We have legal routes through the Afghan visa system where we've allowed in 20,000 Afghans. We have a legal route with the Ukrainians at the moment, and 16,000 have come through. And we have a legal route with the BNOs Hong Kong, where we've had 97,000. So since 2015, we've had 158,800 people who have come in through legal routes. The question that Charlotte has is whether we should establish its centres in every country in the world where these migrants are coming from and seeking asylum, when we know from the United Nations and other organisations that nowadays between 60 and 70% of all asylum applicants are economic migrants.
OK, Stephen, Scarlett Maguire's got a question. She wants to come back on something you just said.
So as you know, the Afghan route is basically not working. The Syrian route closed last year. What you're saying is that some people are allowed in, and I have to say that the Ukrainian one is not about refugees, and each one of them has to have a visa. They're not refugee visas, and the Hong Kong is not refugees either. They're visa people. What I'm saying is, if you are a person seeking sanctuary, if you are a refugee from a country, how do you get here legally?
Well, as I say, if you have one of the government programs in the past, you could do so. And at the moment, you're right that the Syrian program has ended. So there are no government schemes available at the moment where you can come through on the legal process. In that sense, you're correct at the moment. It doesn't mean that we won't do it in the future. But what we also know is that there are roughly around 66 million people in the world moving from the country, from around the globe, who are what's going to be referred to as asylum seekers. The point is, how many are we going to take? And then we have to have an established route here where we're running out of space. One of the major points that was made in the 4 documents that was issued by the government today is that we're paying roughly around £5 million per day in contingency accommodation. That's just the hotels. So we're paying 1.72 billion a year in hotels, alongside 4 billion that we're paying 3 major companies for accommodation. We're running out of space, which is why the government was begging people to taking Ukrainian applicants in their homes, because we haven't got the space to house any more.
Stephen, there we're going to leave it, but we appreciate your contribution as ever. Thanks very much indeed, Stephen Wolfe,
Thank you.
for joining us there. Well, what's political reaction been like? Obviously, you can guess at what's been said from opposition parties. We just heard one at the end of Darren McCaffrey's show. But interestingly, the Defence Committee chairman, Tobias Ellwood, less than sympathetic today, claiming Boris Johnson's rushed out the Rwanda plan to distract from his woes over Partygate. Let's turn to Tom Hunt, the Conservative MP for Ipswich. Mr. Hunt, welcome to you. This is an expensive scheme. It's going to involve sending people 4,000 or 5,000 miles. They could then just start their journey all over again and wind up back on a French beach bound for Britain.
Well, there is a cost associated with it, but I must add there's a very, very significant cost associated with the status quo, where I think, as you touched upon earlier in the show, last year 28,000 people made the journey. Indications are that this year could be more than double that. And a lot of these people are ending up in hotels, which is at vast expense to the British taxpayer. And also the problem is, with the numbers going where they are, it feels almost never-ending, the cost. Whereas actually, I think such is a deterrent effect of offshore processing that actually I think we'll find that it might not be as much as many people are suggesting. But one way or another, we've got to get a grip on the situation, and I welcome what was announced by Prime Minister today.
Tom Hunt, can you just give an answer to a question put by my studio guest, Scarlett Maguire, today, which is, if you are an asylum seeker, not an economic migrant, but if you are genuinely somebody facing persecution, let's say you're a Christian in Pakistan and you face religious persecution and you've got family in the UK, Pakistani Christian diaspora, you'd like to join it, what do you do?
Well, I think the key point here, though, is we're talking about individuals who are looking to get into our country from France, which of course we know is a safe European country. So for me, the key thing is ensuring that these individuals are, safe and that they're away from persecution. They are in France, and of course they would be in Rwanda as well. So I think that is the key question. We are dealing with individuals here who are 70% men under 40, who are coming to us from France, which is a safe country where they could have claimed asylum, and they also could have claimed asylum in numerous other European countries they went through, presumably, to get to France. There is significant pressure on public services. I think since 2015, we've taken in 185,000 refugees, is my understanding. Yep. We've got to be prioritising those who are genuine refugees who are coming from the areas in question, close to the areas.
And the thing is, Tom Hunt, as I understand it, the way the systems work is that a snap determination will be made about whether somebody is an economic migrant or not, if they are on the plane to Rwanda. I've covered stories on many occasions where the government's trying to deport people, for instance, back to the Caribbean. We're talking about people who've been murderers and rapists. They book seats for 50, about 10 get filled because of last-minute legal appeals. And the Prime Minister hinted today, this will get bogged down in lawfare, in judicial activism. The usual suspects will come out and say, it can't happen.
Yeah, I don't doubt the fact that there'll be challenges. Of course there'll be challenges. There always are. But I'm pretty confident, from what I heard today from the Prime Minister, he's got quite a lot of fight, and I think he's pretty determined to take on those challenges and win. That's a good thing. I think we'll be able to achieve a certain amount with this, but yes, it could well mean that we have to make further legal changes, which the Prime Minister hinted at today. And if that's the case, so be it. But, we've got to get a grip on this. And actually, Australia, they had a big problem with illegal immigration in Australia, a big problem. And then they engaged with offshore processing. Today, they don't have a big problem when it comes to illegal immigration. They were left to criticising Australia, saying it didn't work in Australia. Well, everything I've seen says it did work in Australia. And they haven't got a problem today with illegal immigration in the way that they did many, many years ago. And I'll also add that the Liberal government that introduced those measures was re-elected time after time as a result.
OK, Tom Hunt, Conservative MP for Ipswich. Got to leave it there. Thanks very much indeed for your time. Just a quick word from Scarlett Maguire, who I think will disagree with quite a lot of that, including the assertion that the Australian experiment worked. We're going to be talking to Alexander Downer, former Foreign Minister of Australia, next hour.
I will leave that, but he still hasn't answered the question of, if you are somebody seeking refugee, how do you get to Britain? And the answer is, there is no way. And
what do you say to those people who say there are loads of countries in the world, Britain takes in lots of people as economic migrants into the country, hundreds of thousands, and has done historically? What about those countries in the Gulf, for instance, who take nobody?
No, but let's look at Europe, right? Let's look at what happened after Ukraine. Instead of opening our doors, we went, oh, no, you have to have visas. You have to. The whole thing has got completely bogged down.
We've ventilated that loads of times before.
And meanwhile, Germany takes 1 million. The Syrian refugees coming through. The Syrian refugees. Actually, what we need to do, seriously, what we need to do is to see this as a global problem. Right.
Where everybody does their bit. And the truth is that Western European countries do far more than they should. And there are some countries, for instance, in the Gulf, very wealthy countries, who do naff all. We'll come back to that one. It's my show. No.
Yes, Colin.
No, the SNP has confirmed that Scotland will become the last of the British home nations to drop the legal requirement to wear face masks. The ban will be lifted from Monday, but Nicola Sturgeon says she would still, quote, strongly recommend that the public persist in covering their faces in crowded places. Why has the SNP struck the hardest COVID line during the course of the pandemic? Does it reflect an authoritarian streak within Scottish nationalism, or is it the mark of a cautious leader, given how high rates of infection have remained in Scotland? Joining me now, former member of the Scottish Parliament, Brian Monteith. Brian, welcome to you. A happy day for many Scots on Monday.
Certainly, it will be a day to rejoice, but whether it'll last, we can't say, because the thing about Nicola Sturgeon is there was no reason to continue with masks. She never actually had any science-based evidence to carry on, and she's not produced any science-based evidence now to remove the statutory force of them. It's effectively posturing, and the posturing is to actually look tough and strong and be the mammy of Scotland. That's what it's all about. There's an election coming up, and now she wants to look like the liberator.
She can point to the data, though, can't she? I mean, whatever the reason may be, and neither of us are epidemiologists, it was the case that per person, more people in Scotland had COVID than in any other part of the United Kingdom. That may have been actually because they'd locked down hard, and then once the measures started to come off, the virus spread more rapidly, given that it was Omicron. But whatever the reason, she can point to the data and say, we've got a worse problem than England or Northern Ireland or wherever, so we are taking it more seriously.
Well, that's the strange thing. She can point to the data, as you say, but England had already removed the masks, and you could see that, in fact, the case numbers had gone down in England, while Scotland persevered with the masks, and the numbers went up. So the science really didn't support her. And of course, there's just complete hypocrisy in this. She says we're getting rid of the law, but we should follow guidance, and it's a good thing to wear them. Well, of course, when she turned up at the Duke of Edinburgh's memorial, guidance is still, even in England, in settings like that, you might want to wear them. We didn't see Nicola Sturgeon, who was enforcing masks in Scotland, wearing a mask in Westminster Abbey. No, she chose not to. And it's this double standards that I think people see and now know that masks were really about fear, not about good science.
Brian Monteith for now. Brian, very good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. Scarlett Maguire is with me this afternoon to reflect on all the stories we're doing. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of Nicola Sturgeon, but I think the idea of her turning up to Westminster Abbey for that memorial service for the Duke of Edinburgh, and if she and her husband had been the only two wearing masks, it would have felt odd. It would have actually almost signalled that she wanted attention.
Well, yeah, it would have been, this is the me show. I mean, I think she did the right thing. I actually don't understand this real problem people have with masks. I mean, I'm slightly biased, I'm immunocompromised. Every time I go on the tube, I look at all these people without masks and hope that they haven't got COVID. But actually, that's all I do. I mean, you can walk around. I saw the pictures of people wearing masks outside. You certainly don't have to wear them outside. But you just think, why can't people wear masks? I mean, I was having this argument in the car this morning on the way to a funeral.
Because they want to see other people's faces, because they want to see expressions.
On the tube.
Wherever.
I mean, but I'm talking about very few things where it's quite dangerous.
In school corridors, in secondary schools.
I think there's a problem with schools, and I think that Nicola Sturgeon did go over the top, but Boris Johnson, because he's a Conservative, refused to mandate for masks. So all the time, every time you went on the tube, even when masks were popular, people didn't have to wear them, even when there were signs saying wear them. It really, I mean, you think it's so little to do for all the people who actually really, I mean, I've caught COVID twice, so I'm not worried about it. But I just think, why can't we wear masks? Why do people make this fuss about masks?
I'll tell you why, but it's going to take me at least an hour or so.
We disagree about everything.
Well, it's sometimes heat and light You know,
yes.
Our daily debate today, more debate. Boris Johnson has said illegal migrants can build a new life in Rwanda. Is he really serious? We'll hear both sides of that one. But first, the latest news headlines with Polly.
Colin, thank you. The headlines this hour. The Royal Navy is taking over command from the UK's border force in the English Channel under new government plans to tackle illegal migration and people trafficking. The Prime Minister's confirmed that asylum seekers will be flown to Rwanda in Africa for processing as part of a £120 million deal. Boris Johnson says the government will have the capacity to resettle tens of thousands of migrants over the coming years and that the scheme will disrupt the business model of people traffickers. Meanwhile, ambulance response times and A&E performance levels in England have dropped to their lowest level on record. That's as the latest figures show 6.2 million patients are currently on the NHS waiting list, with 23,000 waiting more than 2 years to start routine treatment. But coronavirus infections have fallen across most of the UK, although levels in Wales do remain at a record high. The Office for National Statistics estimates a total of 4.4 million people were likely to have had coronavirus in the UK last week. That's down from the record 4.9 million on the previous week. Chelsea Football Club director Eugene Tenenbaum and another oligarch, David Davidovich, have been hit with sanctions worth up to £10 billion. Both men are closely associated with Chelsea Football Club owner Roman Abramovich. And the Queen, who has for the first time missed the Royal Maundy service today, is expected to miss the Easter Sunday event too because of mobility issues. The Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall represented the monarch today, handing out Maundy money to community members from across the country. On TV, online and on your radio via DAB+, you're with GB News. Stay with us. Brazier will be back in a moment.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you, or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Not far off 20 to 5. Can migrants start a new life in Rwanda? That's our debate question today in light of the launch of a really big shift in British migration policy. It was announced this morning by the Prime Minister in Kent, and the Home Secretary played her part, Priti Patel, who is in Kigali. This is what the PM said.
Economic migrants taking advantage of the asylum system will not get to stay in the UK, while those in genuine need will be properly protected, including with access to legal services on arrival in Rwanda, and given the opportunity to build a new life in that dynamic country, supported by the funding we are providing.
Well, what will it mean for the young men? And our understanding is that it's only single men who will be sent to Rwanda when they get there. We know they're to be housed in a facility currently used by budget travellers after their case is first processed in the UK. Britain will pay for the 5,000-mile one-way ticket to Rwanda, where they'll be offered automatic asylum. But will they want to stay? Think of Rwanda. Many people will remember the terrible genocide of 1994. However, today, some say it's much improved. Some describe it even as the Switzerland of Central Africa. I think they mean that as a compliment. Joining me for the debate is Ben Habib, the businessman and former MEP here in the studio. Scarlett Maguire, the communications consultant and former Labour Party advisor. Thanks for taking part, both. Ben Habib, we'll start with you. What did you make of the PM's announcement today?
Well, I thought it was really odd. A very complex system to not enforce our borders, not to take control of our borders, but actually to let people in as we're letting them in at the moment, and then pick out single men, as I understand it, fly them at vast cost, no doubt after judicial challenges in the UK have been heard, fly them at vast cost to Rwanda, and then hope that the Rwandans will treat them in a manner which won't come back to bite the British government in the future. So it seems to me a failure, actually, to protect our borders. It's complex legally. It's going to be incredibly expensive. And I think it has all the hallmarks of moral hazard, which is going to come back and bite our government in the United Kingdom in the months ahead. And I can just see this scheme either never getting off the ground properly, or if it does get off the ground, us having to reverse our position on it after photographs come back from Rwanda with people kept in concentration camp-like conditions. I mean, I can just see all of that now.
I'm going to let you put that one in quotation marks, Ben, concentration camp conditions. Let me just put some of those thoughts to Scarlett Maguire, who's here in the studio with me. I mean, Ben makes a very good point about the potential risk of damaging stories. Something goes seriously wrong in Rwanda, and in a sense that becomes our responsibility. We sent them there. But this isn't just a scheme that's been dreamt up solely by the United Kingdom. If you look at the Danish government, centre-left government, quite liberal in many respects, they've been exploring a very similar scheme.
Look, I mean, the last people who sent people to Rwanda was Israel. And what happened was after 2 days, the people smugglers got hold of them and they started getting back to Israel. Rwanda does not have a good reputation for looking after refugees. And very, very important, actually, is Ben talked about the cost. The Daily Mail says it'll be more expensive than the Ritz. Well, the people I spoke to said you might as well buy a house for each one of them. That's how much it's going to cost. If you look at what happened in Australia, which I know we're moving on to, the costs are phenomenal. The costs are phenomenal, and there's a question about whether it works. So it's not about deporting the people who are economic migrants. It's about deporting everybody. And what Boris said is there will be access to legal services, and then if you are accepted as an asylum seeker in Rwanda, that's where you're going to stay. So there is no question that you come back to Britain as a genuine refugee, and that's one of the many, many things that's wrong with it.
Ben Habib, what would you do instead? I mean, you're not a fan of this plan as outlined by the Prime Minister. What's your alternative?
Well, I think we've got to be tough at our borders. The Prime Minister, as part of what he disclosed this morning, is going to put the Royal Navy in charge instead of Border Force. But whether it's Border Force or the Royal Navy, it's at the point that these people enter our waters that they need to be taken to task. And frankly, we've got to toughen up with France. We've got to toughen up our approach to these people as they attempt to enter our water. We've got to tow them back to the French coast and dump them back on French beaches, which is where they came from, and which, by the way, is a French obligation to uphold. The French have a bilateral agreement with the United Kingdom to prevent these people coming across the channel. We have paid the French government £250 million to ensure that that happens. And actually, we've seen repeated footage of French policemen standing by just watching these boats being launched. We need to take much tougher unilateral action at the point that these people enter our waters, not once they're on our shores, having all the legal rights to, representation in court, fighting things through to appeal, and then at vast cost being sent off to Rwanda and all the rest of it. We've got to stop this at our borders. If he's serious about taking control of our borders, then it has to happen at the United Kingdom's international border point in the sea.
Scarlett Maguire, the problem with the international border point in the sea, and the Prime Minister made it very clear today that the Home Office have looked at this. They've looked at using jet skis to push back the small boats, bigger boats to tow them back. The problem is the first person who goes in the water can't swim and dies. That's the end of the policy and a personal tragedy. Every single course the government takes here, you've already suggested there could be some bad press if things go wrong in Rwanda. Maybe they just need to accept the bad press. Otherwise, the numbers will keep on growing. They tripled this year.
Well, I mean, certainly you're absolutely right that this turning them back when they enter British waters just is never going to work. They've been trying it for a couple of years.
Disagree.
Well, it isn't working. I mean, that's the point. Is actually
we haven't tried
the Navy does not want to have to do things like the thing. These are people, right? That's what we have to remember. These are desperate people. And many of them...
They're not desperate people. They're economic migrants. They're coming from France. They're not coming from...
An economic migrant can be desperate, right? And we all know that there are children on these boats. We know that the Navy doesn't want to do this. We know that. I mean, that's just a statement of fact. We know Border Force doesn't want to do it. So this idea that you're going to push these boats back, and as you said, Colin, you tip over one of these flimsy dinghies or you puncture it or something and it's game over. So actually, it's just...
But Scarlett...
What we've got to do is... We've got to do a European, and I know this is what you hate, but actually Europe has got to work together to work out what we're going to do about migration. And to say it's your fault, France, that's it, isn't going to work. I mean, that's the whole problem.
We have a bilateral agreement with France. It is their accepted fault. They take good money from the British Exchequer to ensure that this doesn't happen. We have to be much more forceful at the border. And yes, you're right. This is a European problem, in large part as a result of freedom of movement across Europe, because the minute they get into Europe, they can go right across Europe and come straight to our front door. And why is it that they don't want to stay in France? I mean, what is wrong with France?
A lot of them do. Hold on. A lot of them do want to stay in France. A lot of them stay in France.
Well,
many more go to
stay in France.
Many more go to Germany, right? The people who want to come here they speak English, they tend to have family here. I mean, that's what it is. It's not that Britain is this amazing oasis that all the migrants want to come here. Most European migrants, most people who... And remember, these are people who often have already crossed seas to get to Europe. They stay in Europe. And a few of them, thousands, but considering how many migrants are on the move in Europe, come to Britain. Most of them never leave the mainland of Europe, and they never want to.
Tens of thousands, and in breach of our international agreement with France, in breach of France's international obligations generally, they need to be pushed back. And the vision that you painted, Colin, of people, drowning at sea, well, they need to be pushed back before they get into British waters. They need to be given clear warnings. And if they come in, they need to be towed back in. And if they jump out of their boats and the odd boat capsizes, well, that is their fault. They would have had good warning and they would have had safe passage back to France if they'd allowed the British Navy or Border Force, whoever it is, to take control. If they resist, well, so be it. That's on their head. They should go back to France, which is a perfectly sensible country, give or take Macron.
but why are they risking their lives to come to England? I mean, that is the question that you have to ask. For some reason, those people are desperate to come to England, and we all know...
Well, go on, Scarlett, have a guess.
Well, I think it's because it's because they speak English, because they've got family here, because they feel they can settle here.
What do you think it is, Ben?
Well, I think it's the generosity of the British Exchequer again. They get treated incredibly well once they land here. The cost of housing these illegal migrants, which is what they are, is about £4 billion a year, and that's only because we put them up in decent hotels, feed them, clothe them, look after them.
Decent hotels. We put them up in army barracks.
Scarlett, if you wanted to get into UK during lockdown, you couldn't do it other than across the channel. But these people didn't have to do COVID tests to get into the UK. They just got in a dinghy and came across. I mean, the whole thing is a farce, frankly. And we don't have control of our borders. You look at what Poland did when Belarus was lining up. I don't know if you recall this, but Belarus lined up. Effectively, they created a refugee crisis for Poland.
I mean, come on, that was different.
They left people to freeze to death.
Well, no, hang on. They succeeded in stopping a people smuggling operation which had political support from the Belarusian presidency, and they succeeded in turning the tide, and people ended up flying back to Iraq, etc. But that was easy because it was a land border. We've got the English Channel to contend with, which we've always assumed hitherto was freighted with advantages until we realised 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago that people weren't just coming over during high summer when the waters were passive, but actually they're coming round the clock all year round. So I'll come back to my original question. Both of you will just wind this up. We're talking about Rwanda. Will it have a deterrent effect for some people, Ben Habib? Will the message go down the smartphone chain back to the countries of origin? And if people here, actually you may end up being sent to Rwanda, will that have a deterrent effect?
Well, if it works and people get sent to Rwanda and they have a good life in Rwanda, it may even encourage more people to try the trip because they get a free flight to Rwanda. And the notion that it's going to deter people from coming to the UK is predicated on going to Rwanda being an awful outcome.
I do love this job. I do love this job. Somebody's always capable. I do love this job. Somebody's always capable of thinking something I hadn't thought of. Scarlett, last word to you. Will it be a deterrent?
I think in the end it won't be, that they'll find another way of getting here. I think what it will be a deterrent to is when are we going to allow refugees into this country?
To which some will say there have been for decades. Scarlett Maguire, she's winding up again. Scarlett Maguire and Ben Habib, thanks both very much indeed for a civilised debate. Thanks very much indeed. Coming up, the days of chicken soup and soggy sausage rolls in hospitals. Some people want them to come to an end. A group of Scottish MPs and doctors urging the NHS to ban meat from hospital meals. First, the weather.
Hello, I'm Helen Roberts. For most of us this Easter weekend, there will be some warm spells of sunshine around at times, just turning a little more unsettled as the weekend progresses, particularly into Easter Monday. But until then, high pressure is dominating our weather. There is this weather front out to the west. This will bring a change as the weekend progresses, but it's slow progress. So until then, there's plenty of fine weather around. Through this evening and overnight, clear spells, some patchy cloud and some thicker cloud across parts of northwest Scotland, perhaps thick enough for a few outbreaks of patchy light rain. Also some mist, fog and low cloud developing around some coasts, and that will be with us first thing tomorrow. But it will tend to lift and break as the day progresses tomorrow. One or two coastal areas may just hold on to some mist and low cloud right the way throughout the day, and we will tend to see slightly more in the way of cloud across some western areas for Good Friday, but elsewhere plenty of warm spells of sunshine around. Now, we will see some quite sharp showers developing across parts of Northern Ireland through the afternoon on Good Friday, and later in the day developing across parts of southern Scotland and northern England too, but elsewhere plenty of warm sunshine around. And in fact, talking of temperatures, it could be the warmest day of the year so far, with temperatures perhaps reaching 22 Celsius in parts of the southeast. Now, overnight Friday, again, a mixture of clear spells and some patchy cloud. Still a few showers in parts of the north and northwest, but a lot of dry weather around again, and it won't be a particularly cold night. Temperatures holding up fairly well. And that takes us into Saturday, which on the whole is another fine-looking day for many of us. There will be some bright or sunny spells around and a lot of dry weather into the weekend. So just to recap then, Saturday stays fine for most of us, clouding over from the west though on Sunday and turning cooler on Monday.
Coming up tomorrow at noon.
Welcome to a very special GB News Easter programme. We are invited during this short time to enter into the passion, death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's an invitation to take part in the most important part of the Christian life. Happy Easter. Alleluia.
The Meaning of Easter with Calvin Robinson tomorrow at noon on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you, or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
We're going to leave the story about Rwanda and the deterrent effect or not of a new scheme to send asylum seekers and economic migrants there. We're going to talk about something else. Scottish GPs and clinicians, they've written to NHS executives urging them to ban meat from hospital meals. An open letter sent to Caroline Lamb, had to be, didn't it? Chief Executive of NHS Scotland claimed that serving only plant-based meals would save millions of pounds and improve the health of those being treated. Let's talk about this with an NHS doctor, Talua Adepeju. Doctor, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it. To be absolutely clear about this, we're talking about a handful of GPs in Scotland. They're not representing an official body. It's their own opinions. But I just wonder how, well, one, what you think about the idea of banning meat in hospital meals, whether you're one of those people who actually feels that meat is part of a diet that keeps people healthy, and what you make of doctors expressing a view like this at all.
So I'd say just in terms of meat, banning meat in hospital meals, I mean, I'd say we need to still have the choice. You know, it's quite unfair for people who, you know, do eat meat regularly and people who aren't vegan to not have the choice to eat meat in hospital. Because I know already it's kind of an issue, making sure patients eat their meals and things like that. So if you give them less options, I'm not sure how well that will play, unfortunately. I do understand, obviously, the health, you know, implications of going completely vegan, but it's all about choice. You need to have that choice there, don't you?
Well, I mean, the choice that people really want, I mean, yes, choice is nice, but choice between nice nice hospital food and awful hospital food is the key choice, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just in terms of, I wonder whether, really now, Doctor, there's a cohort of junior doctors coming through now who are much more emblematic of their generation, and actually they're not backwards about coming forwards when it comes to veganism, and they make the argument regularly that plant-based food is healthier. I disagree with them vehemently, but they are, I think, increasingly assertive. Just on my second point to you about whether it's right that doctors feel fit to express what is, I think, quite a political view in its own way, at least with the sort of culture wars, or do you think that actually doctors should just treat people for their ailments and otherwise keep stum?
Well, I mean, obviously, as doctors, you have your opinions on what you believe is healthy, what you believe is right and wrong. But I do see where you're coming from, with regards to not letting your opinions affect the way you treat patients. I suppose banning meat would do that, wouldn't it? It would be you saying that meat is, in my opinion, completely unhealthy, and as such, it should be banned for all patients. Which I do agree with you on that point. It's not. At the end of the day, all we can do is treat what patients eat and don't eat. We shouldn't really have influence on that, I believe. Obviously, sorry, go on.
Sorry, Julie, we've got to leave it there. We're almost out of time, but thanks ever so much for yours, as ever. Thanks very much indeed. Scarlett Maguire, quick thought. Meat in hospitals?
Well, the problem with meat in hospitals is it'll be really bad meat because it'll be cheap meat. So it probably is bad for you, actually. But I actually agree with him. And I don't eat meat, but I do think that people should be given the choice. But I really agree with you, is bad food in hospitals. Well, I mean, I always lose weight if I go to hospital. It is inedible.
I have to say, I didn't make that connection until I read the script about Christina Lamb. That's called nominative determinism, isn't it, I believe? more of that to come. Much more too from Scarlett Maguire and the rest of our guests today, looking at Boris Johnson's big announcement when it comes to migration, a plan to send people to Rwanda. It's 5 o'clock. So coming up in the next hour, full coverage of Britain's new refugee policy. A former Australian foreign minister tells me why the only thing that acts as a deterrent against economic migrants is the prospect of being sent somewhere they don't want to go. We'll ask a former Royal Navy Admiral how the Ministry of Defence will get involved in its deployment against illegal migration. And with the government set to send large numbers of asylum seekers to Rwanda for processing, we'll find out more about the history of the country. I'll be joined throughout the show by former Labour Party advisor Scarlett Maguire. But first, the headlines with Polly.
Colin, thank you. It's 5 o'clock. You're with GB News. And as you've been hearing, the Royal Navy is taking over command from UK Border Force in the English Channel under new government plans to tackle illegal migration. The Prime Minister has also confirmed asylum seekers will be flown to Rwanda in Africa for processing as part of a £120 million deal. Boris Johnson says they'll have the capacity to resettle tens of thousands of people over the coming years, and the scheme will also serve as a considerable deterrent. He told a news conference the partnership complies with international obligations, but he is still expecting a legal challenge.
The asylum system is already costing this country £1.5 billion a year. The hotel costs are now £5 million a day, and it's climbing. And unless we can beat the business model of the gangs, I'm afraid it will continue to climb. And what we need to put in place is the deterrent system that will change their minds, make them see that they've made the wrong deal and that there's a better path for them if they really want to come to the UK.
Boris Johnson. Well, Amnesty International UK is criticising the scheme. Refugee and Migrant Rights Director Steve Valdez-Simon says it's similar to Australia's policy, which he says doesn't work and is too expensive.
Australia has not offshored, as it's called, anyone since 2014. But it has held on to its offshore facilities because it's been unable to shut them down even though it's been trying since 2017 to do so. And it's been paying huge amounts of money, unfortunately, to do incredible amounts of cruelty to the relatively few people that it's offshored, while people have continued to arrive in Australia, including by boat.
Amnesty International. Here in the UK, ambulance response times and A&D performance targets in England have dropped to their lowest point since records began. That comes as the latest figures show 6.2 million patients are currently on the NHS waiting list, with 23,000 waiting more than 2 years to begin routine treatment. Top surgeons are describing the data as shocking. Dr. Bob Gill says a decade of underfunding is to blame.
There's been real terms shrinkage in the wages of doctors and nurses, anything up to 15 to 20%. So the NHS is not retaining staff. We had Brexit, which led to a bit of an exodus of European staff within the NHS. And we've also had a massive reduction in NHS bed capacity. So without the staff, without the funding, and without the bed capacity, it's rational that the waiting lists are going to rise.
Meanwhile, the UK's medicines regulator has approved the use of the COVID Moderna vaccine in children aged between 6 and 11 years old. Earlier today, a sixth coronavirus vaccine produced by the French firm Valneva was also given the green light. The UK is the first country in the world to approve the jab. International news, and Russia is warning it's going to deploy nuclear weapons and hypersonic missiles in the Baltic Sea if Sweden and Finland join NATO. The two countries are on the verge of applying for NATO membership following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, says if the countries do join NATO, the balance will be restored and there'll be no more talk of a nuclear-free region. Meanwhile, US intelligence believes the Russian warship, the Moskva, is still dealing with an extensive fire on board. Earlier, the Ukrainian military said it had hit the Soviet-era flagship with a missile causing serious damage. Officials said it reportedly started to sink after ammunition on board the vessel exploded. The warship's now believed to be heading towards the port of Sevastopol. Moscow claims crew members were evacuated from the ship. More than 300 people have been killed in floods on South Africa's eastern coast. Heavy rains have blocked roads and disrupted shipping in Durban. Hundreds of people have been displaced in what's being described as one of the worst flooding events in South Africa's history. The country's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, pledged to help after visiting families whose homes had been destroyed. Here, the Queen is expected to miss the traditional Easter Sunday service at Windsor Castle this weekend because of mobility issues. That comes after she missed today's Royal Maundy service for the first time. The Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall represented the monarch instead, distributing money as part of an ancient tradition to community members from across the country. Sport, and Scotland's delayed World Cup qualifier against Ukraine has been rearranged for the 1st of June in Glasgow. The match had been due to take place in March, but was postponed due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The winner will play Wales in the final playoff 4 days later. You're with GB News. More news as it happens. Now let's get back to Colin Brazier.
Well, we start today with my take on the Rwanda announcement and a question. Did you hear it? All over London today, the stamping of little feet, the Twitter tantrums of people who think they really run this country. Not the ones you elected, but the campaigners and lobbyists and some commentators. They had two reasons to be cross. First, they hate the idea that the public might actually want to control who comes into the country, even if that means putting migrants on a plane to Rwanda. Second, they were driven to distraction by the idea that Boris might be wriggling off the Partygate hook. Exhibit A, Michelle Hussein, this morning on the BBC radio programme she co-hosts. She said, "Why should people stick to legal migration routes when the Prime Minister has acted outside the law?" Think about that question from our licence fee-funded state broadcaster. Was Hussein really asking if a migrant pondering whether to pay an illegal people smuggler might now feel emboldened to do so because laws were broken when parties were held during lockdown at Downing Street? Wow. The BBC's obsession with that story was obvious when the PM announced his new Rwanda policy. The corporation got to ask the first questions after his speech, and sure enough, the BBC didn't want to get into the detail of this massive departure for British immigration policy. No, what did they want to talk about?
What would you say to the people watching at home who think that you have been guilty of hypocrisy for not following the rules you told them they must follow? And what would you say to the MPs who think you lied to them?
Well, there are questions that the BBC isn't asking about Boris's, I would say, bold migrant processing experiment, and I'm going to give you 5 of them. Question 1. How many will come if nothing is done? The number crossing by boat is roughly tripling every year. We're now into the tens of thousands using a method once thought totally impractical. So I repeat, how many will come if nothing is done? A year ago, the former British Foreign Secretary, William Hague, wrote in the Times that Britain was in total denial about the scale of the migration wave about to hit its shores. Much of it will be driven by sub-Saharan fertility, where birth rates defy the usual laws of demographic gravity. So how many will come if nothing is done? In time, who knows? Millions? Your guess is as good as anybody else's. Question 2. How many migrant lives will be saved? Dozens have perished in the Channel in small boats, 27 in one incident last year alone, when the Australians introduced a plan similar to the one announced today. It involved sending migrants to be processed in the Pacific 3,000 miles away. The numbers fell dramatically. In 2013, 20,000 migrants arrived by boat in Oz. 2 years later, none did. If nobody's travelling, nobody's drowning. Question 3, why does this policy have to be so dramatic? Why can't we just figure things out with the French? As a younger journalist, I sat in a press conference watching the then French Interior Minister, one Nicolas Sarkozy, sitting alongside our Home Secretary, David Blunkett. They'd found a solution to the migrant crisis, except they hadn't. And the truth is, the French aren't willing to cooperate, and they're often not willing to. It's down to us, the UK alone, to take control and fix this problem. Question 4, how will people smugglers try and evade this new tactic? They can no longer expect British ships to act as a taxi service. No, if a migrant now knows that if they're taken under the arm of the British state, they may end up in Rwanda, then they may resort to more clandestine methods. The days of migrants relaxed and smiling and giving V for victory signs on British beaches may be over. Now the game will be to enter Britain without detection. The fact the military is being drafted in may reflect the fact that some young men will need to be restrained. And by the way, 70% of them are single men under the age of 35. And finally, question 5, will this policy be thwarted? Mr. Johnson was elected on a manifesto that made clear a desire to control illegal migration. We're not alone. The centre-left government of Denmark is also looking at processing asylum applications in Central Africa. And the opinion polls do show support for tough measures here. But as the PM said in his speech, he was braced for legal challenges. Many of those who condemned him today will never have to live in neighbourhoods where the often messy business of multinational assimilation takes place. The lawyers and NGOs and commentators will see this as a moral question. For them, Boris is more than just mistaken about this. In their eyes, being nasty to the huddled masses makes him not just wrong, but bad. And you and me too, if we have the temerity to agree with him. So 5 key questions which the BBC, in common with others, don't necessarily want you to think about today. They'd rather keep banging on about Partygate so they can claim a scalp they believe their journalistic acumen deserves. But make no mistake, today saw the inauguration of a new phase in Britain's culture wars. Priti Patel, in particular, has pulled off the seemingly impossible task of finding what may be a workable solution to a seemingly insoluble problem. After 2 years of COVID paralysis, this government has taken a major step towards delivering on the promise of Brexit. That's the Brazier angle. Well, let's turn just to begin with to Scarlett Maguire, who's going to be my guest for the next hour or so. At least you didn't cross your arms crossly when I said my monologue this time.
Well, I am just as cross. However, to say a couple of things, right? First of all, is that you implied that people supported this. Actually, the first poll out, I know
Snap polls.
Well, the problem with GB News is every time I bring up a poll that is inconvenient, people go, "Oh, polls." But so
it was a snap poll.
Okay, right. So a snap poll. People were asked, "What do you think?" And the immediate reaction was 42% were against, 35% were in favour. So this isn't an overwhelming thing that we want to send people to Rwanda. And it would be nice if instead of calling them economic migrants the whole time, that you actually agreed that there are quite a lot of refugees who are going to end up in Rwanda. And what are we going to do with the asylum seekers? I mean, these asylum seekers who have no other way of getting into Britain, except illegally, are going to be deported to Rwanda. Then they're going to be allowed to seek asylum, but only in Rwanda. So we're not going to have anybody in Britain.
I think...
But let's also talk about the cost. Massive. I mean, Oxford's sort of, whatever, Institute of Migration says it's like building a house for each one of them. I mean, it's not, the Daily Mail says staying at the Ritz. I mean, at the moment, there is no question that migration costs a lot of money, but we are putting asylum seekers up in barracks. This is just absolute and utter madness.
Well,
and it doesn't solve the problem.
It may be mad in your view, but whatever the Oxford Institute of Demography or the Daily Mail think about
Institute of Migration, Institute of Migration,
this is a decision,
and the Daily Mail.
A decision taken by our elected representatives who were elected on a manifesto to deal with migration. I'm going to move on. My next guest has been campaigning for radical changes to the UK's border policy for some years, arguing the quote, supposed immigration system of this country has been wantonly violated by people smugglers who break our laws with impunity. Well, what does he think of it? Alan Mendoza is the co-founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society. Alan, can I just put something to you that Scarlett Maguire, who's with me in the studio today, has been asking about? And I think it's a legitimate question. She wonders if you are, let's say, for instance, a persecuted Christian in Pakistan and you want to move to safety, what is the legal mechanism by which you apply for asylum in the UK, where you may have family, for instance?
Well, yes. I mean, I was going to say the first step is to look at, do you have family? Do you have people who can sponsor you? Are there sort of those kind of options available to you? If that's not the case, then you have to come here. There's no doubt about it. If that's where you ultimately want to end up. The point about this scheme, though, is not about stopping people from entering the country. It's about then processing them in a different place and suggesting that actually we're not saying don't come to the UK. It's saying, look, come to the UK in a certain way. Understand you will then be sent to Rwanda and then you'll be processed there. And what surprises me is that nobody's suggesting that people are going to be mistreated in Rwanda. Nobody's going to suggest that that sort of the conditions we would expect asylum seekers to be kept in are going to be breached in some way, shape, or form. They're just appalled that people are moving them to Rwanda. Now, it's a processing issue. People don't have a right to automatically gain entry to the UK. They've got to be processed. And that's, I think, what we need to be focusing this conversation around. It's about the processing, the conversation about where you go. And equally, if you are, say, a Christian from Pakistan who is in fear of your life, it doesn't matter where you go. You're going to want to go somewhere where you're going to be safe. That's the first duty of care for any refugee, but it's also the first thing that a refugee wants. If, however, you're putting a hierarchy of things on your needs, saying, actually, I demand to go to the UK rather than just a safe place, well, that changes things slightly. Are you actually an asylum seeker then, or are you a migrant? There's questions to be raised about that.
Alan, I'm very happy to talk about the process, and I'm not sure we're entirely clear on what it precisely is at this stage. I think a lot of us thought it was going to be the case that people were picked up on a beach and were sort of effectively deported straight to Rwanda and then would have their asylum claim processed there. From what I've read since, it sounds more like you have a snap decision, there's that word snap again, snap decision on your status, a determination about whether you're an economic migrant or not, and then you're sent to Rwanda. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding. The devil is going to be in the detail, of course, and certainly we've heard, for example, it's only going to be young men who are going to be, there are all these questions that remain to be answered about the actual detail of how this works. So it's kind of difficult to form an overall opinion beyond the general concept until we do know those things. But I'm inclined to, as you say, as a few more details have come out, to believe that it won't simply be picked up and sent over there, because there has to be a determination in the UK as to what, if you're an obvious case, then fine. If you're not an obvious case, then maybe you have to be dealt with here.
Alan Mendoza, there, we've got to leave it today. We're pushed for time, but thanks for yours. Thanks very much indeed. Well, the military to take charge of tackling illegal migrants crossing the English Channel, so said the PM today. Early this year, the government abandoned the pledge to maintain the size of the regular army at 82,000. Will let it dwindle to 73,000, making it the smallest army for 300 years. Will our overstretched forces be able to cope with any new deployments, even one like this in the English Channel? Let's ponder this with a former NATO commander, Rear Admiral Chris Parry. Chris Parry, welcome to you. Is it your understanding this will be a Royal Navy operation or involving different arms of our armed forces?
I think, as always nowadays, it'll be a joint operation, but it'll obviously be fronted by the Royal Navy. And I think what we have to consider here is that the offshore zone is quite a complex pattern. And the Navy is really good at coordinating these types of operation, both for surveillance and also intercept. And I think it's worth recalling that the Royal Navy has already been involved in the Mediterranean in both detecting and picking up people from the sea. So it's not something the Navy hasn't done before. And bearing in mind, this is going to involve quite a lot of investment in drones, aircraft, and additional patrol boats. I think the Navy's best placed to deal with that. One of the biggest problems we got, Colin, in our offshore zone is we got several different agencies that are responsible for different things, like the Marine Management Organisation, the Marine and Coast Guard Agency, Border Force, and bringing that all together in a comprehensive approach is the key to actually dealing with this problem. Frankly, we've been arguing about it for probably 10 years. And nothing's happened. So hopefully this will finally bring together all these agencies and make them really sort of go the same way on the same day.
I just wonder, on the day when we've seen what may be the Russian Navy's flagship sent to the bottom of the Black Sea, and where we are newly aware, aren't we, of the potential conflicts with a blue water navy from the Chinese and all the massive defence threats that the Royal Navy and all the arms of our armed forces currently face, whether at the Admiralty they'll be looking at these proposals and thinking, crikey, we've been asked here to do something else and something which really ought to be left to the Coast Guard.
Well, it has been left to the Coast Guard and the Border Force, and frankly, it hasn't worked. So let's bring in the professionals who are used to coordinating these complex operations at sea and see if they can do better. But Colin, the key issue is against China and Russia. We've got high-end capabilities that deal with that. We're not going to deploy an aircraft carrier or an air defence destroyer into the channel. These will be patrol boats, mine hunters, and other sort of fairly small vessels that can actually do the job. We've been doing fishery protection and economic zone protection for decades. It's just an extension of that. And as I said, if it had been a single offshore zone that we could actually coordinate, we could have done all these things as well. I'm looking forward to the Navy actually getting good experience in these operations, but also applying, should we say, a bit of rigour.
Chris Parry, as ever, really appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. Scarlett Maguire alongside me, just with any thoughts? You've not thrown your two penneth in for a bit.
No, I haven't. I mean, I do agree with Chris Parry that it is about time that it was coordinated properly, and the Navy will do that. And it obviously, whether they're going to make it work any better is a much bigger question, because every time, I mean, the Border Force was supposed to make it work better, and actually there is a real problem about big Navy things and tiny little boats.
Do you agree with my analysis that if you are fearful of being picked up because you might be sent to Rwanda, that you may be less inclined to be picked up? So that either makes you, I mean, those images of men, often men, wearing life vests on the beaches of Kent, giving the V for victory and smiling and looking pretty relaxed. That's going to be a thing of the past, isn't it? Because you're going to want to
They'll find another route. Look, 10 years ago, less than 10 years ago, when we had the whole Calais explosion, they were getting into lorries. They were going on the Eurostar, and they then found the boats. They'll find another way. I mean, that is the thing about people smugglers is they will find another way.
The numbers in the meantime.
And as long as it's men only, so the women and children will go on these terrible boats. I mean, what worries me is it doesn't deal with the problem. The problem is global. The problem is, as you say, it's a lot of people from Central Africa, from South Sudan, like that, desperately coming over. And actually, that's what we've got to start dealing with, instead of sort of sending them back, saying, this isn't our problem.
I've been told to wind up. I'm going to make this point. No, I'm going to make this point again, because I need to keep making this point. And I quote William Hague, former Foreign Secretary, says, guys, wake up. These numbers are not going to stay the same, Scarlett.
That's what I'm saying, Colin. I'm saying it's a global problem. I'm saying it's not about saying, don't bring your boats over here. Okay. I'm saying it's something that we've actually got to deal with properly.
OK. Was that ticking off?
I think it was a ticking off, even though it's your show.
Let's carry on. Crikey. Coming up, what happened when the Australians tried processing illegal migrants offshore, and will the plan announced today work for the UK? First, a break.
I'm Liam Halligan. Join me every weekday at 1 p.m. for On the Money, your daily dose of economics, business and consumer news. I got 25 years experience covering economics and finance. We hold grown-up discussions with a host of experts who really know their stuff. We can't buy gas and store it. That was a mistake, wasn't it?
I think it was a mistake.
Even you, Liam, don't have a crystal ball.
Inflation's a real threat.
Every weekday at 1, you're On the Money.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you, or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Australia introduced a policy of turning back boats of illegal migrants in 2001 and dramatically cut the number attempting the dangerous crossing almost overnight. In a moment, we'll speak to Alexander Downer, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs for Australia. First, let's find out if the UK's new plan is as serious as that brought in by Australia. Matthew Lesh is Head of Public Policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Matthew, welcome to you. I said 2001. I'm not sure that's right. I think it's more recent than that, wasn't it, the Australian policy? You know better than I do. When was it? How did it work?
Look, Colin, that is actually absolutely right. So Australia's been through this debate many times in the last few decades. First of all, around the early 2000s, under the Howard government, when there was a substantial increase of irregular maritime arrivals, or boat arrivals, John Howard introduced what was known as the Pacific Solutions. That included processing offshore, including on Christmas Island, as well as turning around boats and working within the region to try to stop people smuggling from countries like Indonesia. Now, that actually worked extremely effectively. You've got to understand here, in 2001, there were over 5,500 people who arrived by boat. The next year, that went down to just one person in the official statistics. Now, then the Labor government came in 2007. They reversed the Howard policies, and that led again to tens of thousands of people arriving by boat. Then Tony Abbott was elected in 2013. He reintroduced the John Howard policies, and again, that very rapidly decreased the number of boat arrivals.
And by your analysis, Matthew, there is no question in your mind, if tough love works, it saves lives.
Look, I think that's right. I think Australia's policy has been quite successful. There were these tragic scenes of asylum seeker boats crashing up into the rocks in Christmas Island, which is just off the north coast of Australia. And that was dozens, hundreds of people dying. And it's a much longer stretch of ocean between Australia and Indonesia. And there are probably many people who died who we wouldn't ever know about. So the tough love did work quite effectively in Australia's case. So I think now the key question here is, can the UK replicate it? And does this Rwanda solution, is that going to prove effective?
You've done my job for you. That was the question I was thinking about putting to you, but you put it to yourself. So go on. What's the parallel? Does it work?
Look, I think what it's doing in some ways is taking one aspect of Australia's approach and assuming that's the entire approach, which is offshore detention. And that was part of the Australia approach. It was a particularly harsh part of the Australia approach, raised lots of human rights issues, it was quite expensive, but also arguably not actually the key part of what Australia did. What was in fact arguably more important was the boat turnarounds, which Australia did. Australia took people from asylum seeker boats, put them onto unsinkable rafts, and then basically pushed them back towards Indonesia. That took the coordination of the Indonesian government and a lot of acceptance within the region that that's what Australia was doing. So unless you can effectively turn around the boats and have France being willing to take them back, I'm not sure that the Rwanda policy is going to prove quite as effective as Australia's approach.
No, I mean, and the problem is, you talked about the ebbs and flows of the government of the day in Australia. Some days you can have great relations with Paris. Some years it's terrible. And you're going to get those ebbs and flows and fluctuations as a consequence.
That's true. And Australia spent a lot of time working with law enforcement in Indonesia. I think there were likely some transfers when it came to aid to sweeten the deal to Indonesia to ensure that they were willing to accept Australia's kind of approach and law enforcement on the ground to also try to stop people from leaving for Australia in the first place. I think the UK is going to struggle a lot getting France to take the same approach and being willing to accept boats in the same way. And what's the risk is with this Rwanda approach is with the amount of people coming. We don't know exactly how many spaces there are going to be in Rwanda, but my strong suspicion is that it's not going to be the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands that might be necessary in order to mean that everyone who arrives goes to Rwanda. Australia's policy, I should also add under Tony Abbott, was that if you arrive by boat, there was no way you could settle in Australia and you would immediately be processed and settle somewhere else, including in the US and New Zealand in the end. So it doesn't feel like the UK really has the ability. There's also some human rights law issues where Australia, not a member of the European human rights system, could do some things that the UK might struggle to do, legally speaking.
Well, I'm sure there was still a lot of, legal activism by people, human rights campaigners who were saying you can't do this. There must have been a lot of that.
There is an immense amount of legal activism in Australia from human rights groups and refugee activists over the years who've objected to all sorts of things. I mean, and sometimes justifiably. For example, people who were quite unwell in offshore detention, not getting proper medical support. There have been a lot of controversies around the management of the offshore centres. This is something that the UK needs to be care of as well. Is once you send someone from the UK to Rwanda, you take on almost a duty of care for that person. And although Rwanda has obviously improved a lot since the 90s. It's not exactly a shining light for human rights and protection of liberties. So there's undeniably, I think, going to be some issues on the other end. Israel is interesting enough to put something like 4,000 people to Rwanda, and the vast majority of them actually end up leaving the country and trying to make their way back into Europe. So that could end up being the result as well. It's something that didn't really happen in the Australian case.
Matthew, I just wonder in the medium and long term, whether if this doesn't work, something's got to be found that does. And I say that in light of the fact, you work at the IEA, lots of economists, and you spend a lot of time, I'm sure, enjoying graphs and projections. And actually some of the most reliable projections are on demography, the very long-term projections, but you can make, it's more than just guesstimates, which often a lot of economics is. And if you look at the projections, for instance, for the sub-Saharan population explosion in 20, 30 years, and you've already got a diaspora here in the UK, at some point this nettle is going to need grasping, whether it's under this Tory administration or future administrations. Somebody's got to grasp it, because if we're seeing a tripling of the numbers coming across the Channel in boats this year, and you keep seeing that exponential rise, nobody wants to think about this, but where are we going to be in 10 years, 20 years?
Well, yeah, I think that's a huge question. I mean, I'm not here to make predictions about the future. I think you're right, though. There is a huge risk, and the only way this is going to be solved, I think, is in some kind of regional way across Europe. It's a question of people coming into Europe, and there's been a lot of work by the EU previously in this space. I think there's also an underlying issue here in terms of, if you think about demography in a different way, which is the UK does need immigrants in many respects. As an immigrant myself, I might be slightly biased here, but I think immigrants make a huge contribution to the UK, and the UK can be quite generous towards immigrants, as we've seen with the treatment of Hong Kongers, as we've seen with the treatment of the attempted treatment of Ukrainians, as well as Afghans. And I think if you want to maintain a successful immigration system, you actually do need to have good control of it. This is one of Australia's key lessons. Is Australia, during the 2000s, when John Howard managed to stop the boats, had one of the most generous immigration systems in the world, probably twice per capita what the UK is in terms of immigrants. But that was broadly accepted because there was that sense that immigration was under control, that there weren't these irregular maritime arrivals. That all changed when that situation changed, and you had all these people arriving by boat. So if you're someone who supports immigration, it's important that that it is, in order to maintain public support, you maintain it in such a way that you're not having this sense that it's out of control, that the government doesn't know who's coming, and the government doesn't able to basically do its, arguably one of its first and foremost functions, which is to ensure a sovereign border.
Matthew Lesh, really interesting. Thanks ever so much for your time. Appreciate it. Scarlett Maguire's alongside me. Briefly, Scarlett, just some thoughts on that idea, that sort of philosophical principle, really, that if a population thinks they've got real control over immigration, they're more likely actually to be charitable about things.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can see that with Ukraine, actually. I mean, in fact, the so-called problem of immigration has actually gone massively down.
Well, this government would argue because it's been tough on it.
Well, I mean, and you've just been telling me how many boats across the Channel. I mean, either they're tough on immigration or it doesn't work. I mean, you know, I mean, I think one ends up blaming a lot on immigration that is just not true. I mean, the other thing is actually these economic, I mean, refugees, wonderful, but these economic migrants that you're so frightened of, they are people who in 10 years' time will be the entrepreneurs. Well, look, I mean, they are amazing.
You mustn't, you know me well, Scarlett, but you mustn't assume how I feel about things.
No, Colin.
OK, there we go. Thanks very much. Let's bring you the latest news with Polly.
The latest headlines this hour. Imran Ahmed Khan says he's going to resign as MP for Wakefield after he was found guilty of sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy in 2008. This is breaking news coming to us within the last few moments. He's been expelled already from the Conservative Party. In a Twitter statement, he said he's now going to focus entirely on clearing his name, and he apologised to his family and community for the humiliation that it's caused them. More details on that as we get it. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy's taking over command from UK Border Force in the English Channel under new government plans to tackle illegal migration. The Prime Minister confirming asylum seekers will be flown to Rwanda for processing as part of a £120 million deal. Boris Johnson says the government will have the capacity to resettle tens of thousands over the coming years, and the scheme will serve as a considerable deterrent. Ambulance response times and A&E performance levels in England have dropped to their lowest level on record. That's as latest figures show 6.2 million patients are currently on NHS waiting lists, with 23,000 waiting more than 2 years to start routine treatment. And coronavirus infections have fallen across most of the UK, though levels in Wales remain at a record high. The Office for National Statistics estimates a total of 4.4 million people were likely to have had coronavirus in the UK. Last week, that's down from a record 4.9 million the week before. Chelsea Football Club director Eugene Tenenbaum and another oligarch, David Davidovich, have been hit with sanctions worth up to £10 billion. Both men are closely associated with Chelsea Football Club owner Roman Abramovich. And lastly, the Queen, who has for the first time missed the Royal Maundy service at Windsor Castle, is also expected to miss the Easter Sunday event because of mobility issues, we're told. The Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall represented the monarch today, handing out Maundy money to community members from across the country. Those are the latest news headlines here on GB News, on your TV, online and on your radio via DAB+. Stay with Brazier. We're back in a moment.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Nearly 20 to 6. We'll go back to our top story. Prime Minister Boris Johnson's unveiled his new plan for tackling illegal immigration. Male migrants that reach the UK on small boats across the Channel will be flown to Rwanda while their asylum claims are processed. Our Home and Security editor, Mark White, has been to Kent with the Prime Minister to look at the proposals.
Entering Dover Harbour, the all-too-familiar sight of yet another Border Force vessel arriving here, packed with would-be asylum seekers. Hundreds of people pulled from small boats in the middle of the English Channel. 28,500 last year alone, and already this year it's clear that record is set to be smashed. The Prime Minister, deeply frustrated by his government's inability to stem the flow of small boats, is now putting himself front and centre of those efforts, travelling to Kent to meet the teams at the sharp end, as the Royal Navy takes over command and control of Channel operations. And in a major shift of policy, the announcement that most of those who arrive here illegally will be sent on a one-way journey to Rwanda after that African nation agreed a multi-million-pound deal with the UK.
So from today, our new migration and economic development partnership will mean that anyone entering the UK illegally, as well as those who have arrived illegally since January the 1st, may now be relocated to Rwanda. This innovative approach, driven by our shared humanitarian impulse and made possible by Brexit freedoms, will provide safe and legal routes for asylum.
4,000 miles from the UK, the Home Secretary was in the Rwandan capital to see the first in a series of new accommodation blocks being prepared to house the asylum seekers. Those sent here will be processed, and if they're granted asylum, their new life will be in this country. They won't be allowed to settle in the UK. The government is not planning to send women, children or indeed married men to Rwanda, only single males. But that's still the vast majority of those arriving by small boats. Last year, 70% of small boat arrivals were single men. UK authorities are now operating a fleet of these drones over the Channel, and from today the Royal Navy takes over command of Channel operations. In the weeks ahead, these drones will be joined by Navy Wildcat helicopters and a fleet of new patrol boats. Human rights groups have already condemned the plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda as cruel and inhumane. But one Border Force former senior manager believes it's the right thing to do.
Now they won't want to get into the hands of UK authorities because they won't want to go offshore to Rwanda. So the Navy will be able to intercept those people that don't want to be intercepted.
Any move to send asylum seekers to Rwanda could still be some way off, as it's inevitable human rights groups will seek to challenge it in the courts. In the meantime, as hundreds continue to arrive by small boat daily, the government says it's also planning to house asylum seekers in purpose-built accommodation centres, rather than spending the estimated £5 million a day to put them up in hotels across the country. Mark White, GB News, Kent.
Well, migrants have been arriving in small boats in large numbers on European coastlines for at least 2 decades. In 2002, I spent a week reporting from Lampedusa, Italian territory off the coast of North Africa. There, the locals, believe it or not, had stopped eating seafood. They were put off, they said, by the thought that so many migrants had perished, had drowned in the waters off their island. Well, the problem since then has grown like Topsy. Soon there were rickety boats throughout the Mediterranean and nobody had a clue how to deal with the problem. Until, that is, it seems, far away, Australia came up with a workable plan, they said, for which they were much criticised, but which, I have to say inconveniently for some left-wing commentators, seem to have had the advantage of working. Canberra started to send migrants to have their asylum applications processed 3,000 miles away in the Pacific. The numbers arriving in Oz tailed off sharply. How much by? Well, it started in the early 2000s, but by 2013, for instance, there was a peak of 20,000 migrants arriving by boat in Oz. Fast forward 2 years later, none did. If nobody's travelling, the argument runs, nobody is drowning. Joining me, the former Minister for Foreign Affairs of Australia, Alexander Downer. Mr. Downer, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it. Why did the Australian experiment work, do you think?
Well, because the people smugglers who were charging people to make a hazardous journey from Indonesia to Australia weren't able to deliver. They weren't able to get those people to Australia, so no one would buy a passage anymore. As you know, you wouldn't buy a trip on a plane to Paris if you knew that plane was never going to go to Paris. So it was the same principle. Basically, we destroyed the business model for the people smugglers. So, you know, they couldn't make any money out of bringing people to Australia illegally.
And theoretically, I mean, that sounds straightforward enough, but practically, Alexander Downer, how did it work and what were the pitfalls?
So we sort of developed the policy as it went along. We had no precedents, and we developed it in the early 2000s. Basically what we did was we said to people who tried to get to Australia in this dangerous way, you will never be able to settle in Australia if you try to get to our country that way. So we will pick you up, and we made an arrangement with Nauru, and we'll take you to Nauru, and you'll be processed there. And if you're not a refugee, you'll be sent back to your home country. And if you are a refugee, you can either stay in Nauru or we'll find some other country which is safe for you. We won't send you back to your country of origin, of course. And that was that. But what you won't do is be able to come to Australia, because we have a pathway for migrants, but also for refugees to come to Australia. Australia resettles around 20,000 refugees a year. That's the pathway. Otherwise, our only obligation is that you are protected from the persecution that you might have been subjected to in your home country, but that doesn't mean you can come and live in Australia.
I was just talking a few moments ago to an Australian national who painted a picture, actually, of a policy that was in flux very often, and it changed according to the complexion of the party in power. So when the other lot got in, they reversed some of your measures.
They did, though they then reversed their own policy as time went on, because so the Liberal Party is the equivalent of the Conservative Party in Australia. The Liberal government of John Howard introduced this scheme that I've described initially in around 2001. Then the Labor Party won the election in 2007 and they abandoned this policy, and then large numbers of people started coming again on these boats. And it was in particular when a boat sank against the rocks, actually, in Christmas Island between Australia and Indonesia. And a large number of people were killed and drowned by this catastrophe, that the public said enough is enough. You shouldn't be subjecting people to making these incredibly dangerous journeys. And I would say it's the same thing with the Channel crossing. I mean, they're coming in tiny boats in little more than rafts, actually. And, I mean, people should not be subjected to these incredibly dangerous undertakings. It should be stopped. So we did, the Labor government in Australia reversed policy. And then when Tony Abbott became the Prime Minister, the Liberal Party got back into power, that is the Conservatives. They reinforced the policy. And you heard, in your introduction, you talked about the success of the policy. I mean, basically, people don't come to Australia that way at all now.
And, you know, it's not just that what was happening was unsafe, deeply unsafe. It was deeply unjust. I mean, there is something kind of Darwinian about the struggle to get into the UK now or to get into Australia then. And like with all Darwinian struggles, it's better won, more easily won by the hale, the hearty young men, rather than those who need our help the most, namely, very often, people who aren't so well or are older or they're infirm or they've got small children.
Well, in the case of the UK, I think I'm right in saying something like 80% of the people who make these hazardous channel crossings are young men under the age of around 30, and something like 70% of them are unmarried. So, you know, that picture tells you quite a story. They are paying around £3,000 a head to go on this dangerous journey. I mean, and I think, whatever side of the argument you take, this practice should be stopped. And you've got two choices. One of them is to destroy the business model of the people smugglers and sending people to Rwanda for processing instead of allowing them to come to the UK is a very good way of doing it. Or else send ferries across to collect them and have an open border policy and have no immigration policy and just take anybody who wants to come to the UK into the country, because you feel sorry for the 8 billion people who live around the world who don't live in the UK. You know, that could be a policy. I mean, I don't think many people would support it, but that could be a policy. But they are basically your policy choices. Let anyone come here, have an open borders policy, or close down these dangerous journeys.
Alexander Downer is a former Foreign Minister for Australia. We really appreciate your time and your thoughts today. Thanks very much indeed. We'll just get the thoughts of Scarlett Maguire, who's been joined by Ada McGee, who's going to talk about a different story, but I'll just explain to our viewer, maybe surprised to suddenly see you in the studio, that you are here to talk about football. Just on Alexander Downer and the Australian experiment, which he says has been a success and has saved lives. I remember in 2015, sorry to walk you down memory lane again, but I remember being in a studio for a different news channel, and it was just as the boats were really coming online in big numbers in the Aegean. And I remember the reporter of the day who came in to talk about it had recently come back from Australia. And he was telling that story that Alexander Downer just told, basically, that actually, if you want to stop the boats, look at the Australian example. It worked. If you want to stop people drowning, deter them. And after a day or two, that line disappeared from the narrative, from the story that was being told by journalists. I observe.
So what was interesting about him is he said Australia takes in 20,000 refugees a year. We do not have a legal way of refugees coming here. There's no question that we keep on asking people, so how do refugees get here? They don't. That's the problem. So actually what Australia did, and I don't approve of Australia, and honestly, what was going on in those camps in Nauru where people were so depressed, they were sewing their lips together. I mean, it was terrible, terrible stuff. And it cost the Australians a fortune, absolute fortune. I mean, private companies made millions out of it. But what they also did is they took in refugees and they talked to the Indonesians. They talked to the other places and they didn't send them back. So, and quite a lot were resettled in America, and finally they were allowed to resettle in New Zealand. This is about dumping people in Rwanda, actually.
OK, we've got Aidan's here, so we need to bring Aidan in on this conversation, not about migration. You'll be pleased to hear. You've not been booked to talk about that. But the question, we were having our morning editorial meeting this morning, and the question was raised, is football violence making a return? You're a sports analyst, a football writer. Why are we even putting the question? What happened with Manchester City?
Look, football violence is two different things. If you're talking about aggravation on the pitch, that's totally divorced from anything we might see in the crowds, if that's what you're referencing. Yeah. But I don't think that would necessarily lead to an incitement of the crowd. What we saw last night was an exhibition of the dark arts. So the dark arts in football, we hear that phrase in all over sport, all areas of public life. It means a different thing everywhere you go. In football, sometimes it's just trying to gain an advantage over the referee. It's Maradona, hand of God, dark arts. Just
for people who didn't watch the football last night, what happened?
It was 0-0. Manchester City were carrying over a first leg win from last week, which I went to up at the Etihad. City were camped in their own half, really. They were really set upon. You can see some of the aggravation. Basically, Atletico, a highly skilled, proficient, experienced, durable side, but they're not quite as good as City in talent terms, so they decided to rough them up. And inexplicably, the guy on the right there, you can see Stefan Savic, a former Manchester City player, actually in the red and white shirt. He stayed on the pitch. But ultimately, they did lose a man, and it affected them going into the last half an hour of the game. They didn't recover, and City went through, and City stood firm. City were there to be roughed up, and yeah, they were roughed up, but they still got through. They got the aggregate win 1-0. Pep Guardiola didn't even reference what happened on the pitch after the game. Only safe to say that he suffered 2 injuries, which are going to cause him a problem ahead of the FA Cup semi-final on Sunday. John Stones didn't even reference it after the game. They were saying, we're in a third Champions League semi-final in our history. What are we going to worry about what's going on the pitch? We got past a very, very tricky tie. They're going back to Madrid in the next round as well because they got Real Madrid. Hats off, they're learning. It means they're getting wise and they're getting wizened within Europe, and it's been a long time coming.
Aidan, you've seen so much football down the years. Is that gamesmanship, or is that players just losing their rags?
It's a bit of both. I think it started out as gamesmanship, but when it doesn't work, that's when it turns into losing your rag. You have to understand there are cultural differences between how we view that kind of play. In South America, where Diego Simeone, the coach, is from, they think that the noble thing to do is to try and cheat authority a little bit, just to try and win an advantage. And sometimes we think that in this country as well. Things have changed a little bit. We've lost tournaments, I feel, in England by playing the game a bit too Corinthian style, as I would say. Now, if you look at Diego Simeone, you remember World Cup 1998 in San Etienne, England-Argentina. He was the one who provoked a very young David Beckham into kicking him. So he's been doing it since he was playing. He's been doing it since God was a boy. And he imparts it onto his team. Hugely successful, respected individual.
That was one of those moments, Aidan, when I thought football, the devotion to football had reached, I was going to say new heights. It wasn't new heights. It was new low. Well, it was when they were hanging an effigy of David Beckham from some scaffolding in London.
I think that was probably a press stunt up, to be honest with you.
Really?
I think, yeah, I do. I don't have any proof on it, but usually an effigy doesn't come out of nowhere. In the social media era, it's probably worth doing because it will get traction. But back then, it was just to create a picture in a paper. I'm fairly sure of that.
Aidan, it's nice to have you in here. Lovely to
see you.
And happy Easter as well.
Happy Easter to you.
And our thanks to Scarlett McGowan, who's been good fun throughout. Wrong about quite a lot.
No, always right.
Thanks very much indeed. Michelle Dewberry is next. Do stay with us for more news. Stand by.
Hello, I'm Helen Roberts. For most of us this Easter weekend, there will be some warm spells of sunshine around at times, just turning a little more unsettled as the weekend progresses, particularly into Easter Monday. But until then, high pressure is dominating our weather. There is this weather front out to the west. This will bring a change as the weekend progresses, but it's slow progress. So until then, there's plenty of fine weather around. Through this evening and overnight, clear spells, some patchy cloud and some thicker cloud across parts of northwest Scotland, perhaps thick enough for a few outbreaks of patchy light rain. Also some mist, fog and low cloud developing around some coasts, and that will be with us first thing tomorrow. But it will tend to lift and break as the day progresses tomorrow. One or two coastal areas may just hold on to some mist and low cloud right